So when we built the travel form in React, you may have noticed that a lot of the time we were scrolling up and down, and we have a component here that's 146 lines long. Now you'll notice that a lot of this space is being used as display logic, right? It's showing the form, it's displaying UI, it's creating elements, all of this happening inside of the render. But then we also have a place where we're maintaining state, and we have our handle change function, which is doing some business logic. There's been a study done that shows that a programmer's ability to understand the code that they're looking at diminishes dramatically when the file that they're looking at is one in which they have to scroll to see everything. And I've noticed that with my students as well. If I have code that's too long and I'm scrolling around the screen all the time, it's very easy to become disoriented and lose your place, and makes it much more difficult to actually understand what you're looking at. It would be nice if we separated our concerns between the UI logic or the rendering logic and the business logic that actually mandates how the rendered logic changes. And so this idea emerged a few years ago of having a presentational component and a smart component, or a component that's in charge of the business logic. There's a lot of different names that you'll hear: presentational and container components, smart components and dumb components, containers and components, but they all refer to essentially the same thing. The idea is that you have one component whose job it is to maintain state and to have the methods that update state, and then for that component to essentially delegate all of the UI logic or presentational logic to another component that's called a presentational component. That presentational component will only be in charge of receiving props and displaying things correctly. If you'd like, you could read Dan Abramov's Medium blog post where he talked about presentational and container components at this URL. And if you're unfamiliar with Dan Abramov, he's one of the primary developers of the React framework. So let's take a minute to organize some of the code that we've written here. First of all, I currently have everything happening inside of my app component, and I just did that for simplicity, but in reality, I want my app to render my form and let my form do all of the formy things. So I'm going to create a new component called, let's just say, form.js. And I'm essentially going to take everything here, put it over in form, clean up a few things, call it form, and export form. And then over in app, we will make sure to import the form. And since our form is handling all of our state and everything, we basically could change this into a functional component that just renders the form. So maybe I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, that's pretty simple, and you'll see that everything is showing up the same. And remember, way back when, I kind of talked about how I like my app to be sort of a table of contents, where I could put a header above this and a footer below this, and whatever main elements and then delegate the rendering of those main UI components to the other components. So our problem is essentially still the same with form.js because we still have one component that's doing all of this stuff. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create another component. This one we will call form component.js. So essentially you could call these whatever you want. You could have form container.js and form component.js. You could even put them into a folder called form and make form.js actually just index.js and then have form component.js. I've seen it done a bunch of different ways. And for clarity, right now, I'm actually just going to rename form to form container so that it's obvious which one we're looking at. And that just means over in app.js, I'll need to update this to form container. And we're still working. Okay. So opening the form container, I'm essentially going to take all of the rendering logic. Let's get this whole return statement. I'm going to take it out. While I still have it in my clipboard, I'm going to go over to the form component and create just a regular functional component. I'm going to receive props. And let's paste our whole return in there. And fix some of our indenting. Awesome. One thing you might notice that's broken, because we copied this from a component that was a class-based component, we have stuff like this.state.firstname and this.handlechange. Well, this functional component doesn't have a handlechange method, and it doesn't have any state. Instead, it's going to be receiving everything through props. So we'll come back and fix this in a minute. But over on our form container, we now have an empty render. And what we're going to do is let the form container delegate all of the UI stuff to the form component. So at the top, I will need to import form component from the form component file and simply render form component. Like we said, we're going to have to pass a bunch of stuff through props down here, but already we can see that my form is quite a bit simpler than it used to be. Okay, well, let's wire up our form component so that it has all of the same information, because right now, if I refresh this, you'll see that we have some problems. And so what I actually need to pass are all of these properties in state, and I also need to pass my handle change method. So let's start with the handle change method. And I might as well just keep the name the same so that over in my form component, in props, I'm receiving a prop called handle change, which means every time I have this dot handle change, I need this to instead say props dot handle change. Okay, that's a good start. We still have problems because we have no state in this component. So let's go back to the form container. And I have a number of different options, the most annoying of which is I could pass down first name which is this dot state dot first name, and then do this for every one of these properties. But truthfully, that's pretty obnoxious, right? Because my form component is now going to have maybe like 7 or 8 extra lines. Another option is I could just pass everything, the whole state object down as a property called something like data. Say this dot state. This is leagues better than what we had just tried to do, but it does mean that in our form component, we're going to have, instead of this dot state dot first name, we'll have props dot data dot first name. And truthfully, that's not so bad. And in fact, in my personal development life, I have tended towards this, where I pass an object down and I just give it a name. It does mean that I have a little bit of extra typing where I say props.data.firstname instead of finding a way to just have props.firstname. But as we discovered when we were doing the travel form, Scrimba doesn't do so well with the object spread operator, but if you have the correct ECMAScript versions supported in your project, you could simply say pass down all of the properties of this dot state. Doing so would allow you to, in your form component, say props dot first name, props dot last name, and so forth. Again, I have actually leaned towards sending down an object simply because it makes following the props a little bit easier for myself in the future and other developers. But I've seen it used both ways, so it's really just up to you. Here in Scrimba, I believe I'm going to have to do something like this. So now let's go over to our form component and update everywhere it says this dot state. And change this to props dot data. All right, let's see if we have any problems. It says nothing was returned from render. This usually means a return statement is missing. Yeah, I think in my form container, I got rid of my return, which we cannot do. So we're going to put the return back. And we have one more error. It looks like it says that I probably forgot to export my component, which sure enough I did. Okay, we'll export our form component. And it says React is not defined, and that's because I forgot to import React. Okay, and you might remember way back in the beginning, the reason it says that is because JSX is normally not valid JavaScript. And so I actually need the React library in this file so that it knows how to handle JSX. And our form is back up. Let's see if it's working. Good news. Choose a destination. We'll say we have some allergies or preferences, and we're male. And yeah, it looks like everything else is working. Perfect. And as such, we still have a quite large form that we have to scroll a little bit in. But this entire file is only caring about the UI component of our form. Whereas over in the form container, it's only caring about the business logic of the form. This way we have a nice separation of concerns, and it allows us as a developer to essentially have an easier time when we need to make changes to this file. We don't have to scroll up and down over hundreds of lines of code. Now, one thing that's probably good to point out now is with libraries like Redux and with the recently released Context API, I've noticed that the container component split of components here, like we just did, is not actually used quite as often, especially when you are injecting context or global state from Redux or something like that into your components. When you do that, a lot of the business logic is delegated to another place entirely, which kind of means that you end up writing a lot more functional components to simply consume the data that lives in Redux or in some global context or something like that. But as you're developing your applications, this can be a really great way to separate some concerns if you find that you have a lot of business logic and a lot of display logic happening all inside the same component. Hey, with that under our belts, we are ready to move on.